listening right now, but hopefully someday someone sees this somewhere. It is June 26th, and this is the Toronto Perl Mongers. Yay!
Yay!
So we have two presentations this evening. One little piece of administravia is we will be shifting meetings to the last Wednesday of the month, starting next month, just because of venue issues. That's it. Would you like to go first, Mike, or Sean?
You go first.
Okay. Let's see if screen share works. Woo! Hey. Yay! Woo! Oh, that's not it. And, there we go. So hopefully. Whoop. That did not work as expected. How do you do this? I want full screen. Nope.
It's a little white arrow there.
White arrow? This thing?
No, down at the corner. So you can grind through the slides.
Oh, I was just trying to full screen it. Does it matter?
Look at you.
Enter full screen. Is it the right full screen? No. How do you get rid of
it
it?
is Pro.
Oh, this is Firefox, actually. I didn't want to get my Google credentials messed up with the Toronto Pro Mongers. No. Okay. So hopefully this is showing, and my Google Hangout is still working, and this isn't embarrassingly stupid that you're looking at a nice icon of the Toronto Pro Mongers. So I was going to do a talk on Type Tiny, which is something I started using about 4 months ago when I returned to work here at Oanda. Type Tiny is basically a small class for creating moose-like type constraints. It's compatible with moose, moo, mouse. You can use it independently. It is not a type system. It is just checking, as well as some other lovely little things called coercions. So what is a type? It is just an instance of Type Tiny. You can declare them like this. You should never do this. There's some beautiful, wonderful syntactic sugar to declare a new type. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm creating a type called number. I add the constraint saying, in this case, I'm using scalar utils, looks like a number. And if it fails, you'll get this message, input is not a number. Very simple, seemingly obvious. Basically, these objects have a whole bunch. These are just this tiny, tiny little number of functions. You can actually do all kinds of different things with them, particularly in testing. They're all variations on check and validate. So if you run check, it just returns a Boolean value if it succeeds or fails. If you use validate, so validate one returns undef on success, and it returns the error message on failure. In testing, you can use assert valid. So assert valid will return the value, otherwise it will die. Oh, sorry, assert value returns bool. So it doesn't actually return the 1, it returns a Boolean true. So I don't want you to confuse that with none. And if it fails, it dies. And it's going to take a minute to where we really get to the power of it, but we will get there. So Type Tiny comes bundled with a whole bunch of standard types. Most of them are drawn from the Moose basic type system. So the any type is anything, even undef. Bool is for reasonable bool values. Undef is just that, undef. You can just have a constraint just being defined. A class name can be a string, anything that you find for a loaded class that's already in the is-a array. An object is just checking that it is a blessed reference. Stir for a simple string, num for a simple number. This is going faster than I thought. There are some other nifty little types to really speed stuff up. You can use stir match, which you also feed a regular expression. So you have the full power of a regular expression engine that you can quickly, instead of trying to create subtypes of string, you can very quickly create a type that basically matches a regular expression. One thing you often do is create an enum. So instead of using a lousy regular expression, you actually define an enum by giving it a list of strings, and it'll restrict the values to those. Maybe is basically the way to combine undef as a valid value. None of these types allow, well, most of these types do not allow undef. So if it is valid to have a good value or undef, you just wrap it in maybe. So there are parameterizable standard types. So ref is any reference, including blessed objects. And inside the square brackets, you don't have to use the square brackets. It'll just say, is this a reference? True. If you add the square brackets and inside there, you can tell it basically the output of ref that you're expecting. It can be hash, it can be array, it can be scalar, whatever you're expecting. However, you also have all the other ones, other shortcuts, so you don't have to just do ref. So scalar ref is basically ref scalar, array ref, hash ref, code ref. These brackets basically mean that they're parameterizable, so you can add other subtypes in it. An array ref with stir basically means it's an array ref of strings. A hash ref num means a hash ref for which the values of the hash are all strings. There are some other types, there's quite a few of them. One called map is one that actually allows you to restrict. It is a hash ref, but it also allows you to provide two types within that, separated by a comma, and you can restrict the type of the key and the values. And one of the things you can do with TypeTiny that I've found very useful, and I used it for in my recent project, is you can create type libraries, which basically you can define these type constraints first using some syntactic sugar provided by typeutils. And you can basically use this all over your project and have a standard way of specifying and checking a particular value. So I've been working on an exchange rates API, so you need to specify a currency code as your base and a list of currencies that you want to cross that currency against. So I created a type, I declare type currency code as a string match where it is 3 uppercase characters. 3 uppercase characters. That's not restrictive. It doesn't actually check directly against the ISO list of currencies. But that's just the basic one. Now for the quote currencies, I need an array ref of currencies. So now that I already have the currency code, I can just declare this as a subtype by saying it's an array ref of currency codes. So in another part of my code, I can import my library, which here, when you declare type library in your package, it's basically saying, import me some keywords and functions. Although that's mostly typeutil, but declare says handles all the export stuff, handles all the exporter duties. So you list the types you declare inside here that you want exportable, you can get them here. So it handles all the exporter stuff, which is not hard, but it's nice, quick syntactic sugar.
This is just an example of working code.
This is just an example? Basically, yeah. This is my type library is a bit more extensive. So you always, when you import your library, you have to explicitly, it does not export by default. You have to explicitly import the types that you want. I believe, though, it automatically sets up a keyword like -all that lets you pull in all of them. So then you have your type, and you can use it that way if you want, just on check. But I'll show you other ways that it's used. Types don't have to be built in libraries. You can make them on the fly. Anywhere in your code, you can import the standard types, like stir, bool, and all those, and import typeutils. And that gives you all of the keywords. If you'll see back here, I'm declaring a name for this in the library. If you omit the name, you just go declare as instead of declare name, comma, as. You're basically creating an anonymous type and it's returned into the variable. So here I created a simple one, an enumerated list of fields and a subtype of integer, making sure that it is in fact positive. So the restriction when you declare a type, your constraint is just a little where block, which is really just a code block that validates $_ against whatever condition you want. Coercions are the real fun of types. So if you recall the currency code and quote currencies that I did earlier, I can add a coercion to quote currencies, which is basically if you pass the check method, well, not necessarily the check, but I'll show you this later. If you pass this a string, you can use this code block to tell you how to inflate it to the type that you actually want. So in this case, if I just get a string when I actually need an array ref of currency codes, this will throw it into an array ref, and because of this declaration, it will also validate it against the currency code check. So when you inflate this, if you pass it a string of lowercase characters, it'll go boom. But if you pass it, oops, there's a knock on the door. Would you mind getting that? Similarly, for the, I basically did that for a whole bunch of things, but it's a nifty little way to accept multiple input. It works particularly good on dates. If you get something that looks like an epoch, you can inflate that into a date time, or a parsable date string that you can inflate into a date time. So you can also do named coercions, which is basically you can declare this in a library where you are just declaring a coercion, and you tell it on what type it will function on. And it's a very similar thing here. In this case, I'm creating a subtype of, I'm creating a coercion for an array ref that basically takes a string and splits it on /n and puts it into an array ref. I must have mistyped that one. I forgot the array ref. And this allows you to do something like this. You can take the base type and add a coercion line, like in this case the lines from stir coercion, and create another type. You should never put coercions on the base types because you change their behavior globally. Keep your coercions to yourself. Add them on the fly as you need. So I used this extensively with moo. Moo is, for any who aren't aware, is kind of a cut-down version of Moose. It does not have the type system. What you can do here, normally with the ISA, you would provide a subroutine that is your constraint, that checks what this is. So for your ISA, though, you can pass one of your types, and if it has a coercion, you pass that to the coerce argument, which returns a code ref for moo to use. If you were doing this in Moose, all you would need to do is coerce one. It's one of the peculiarities of moo, that you actually have to pass it the sub rather than tell it that there is a coercion. So what this means is if you were declaring a new instance of this package and you pass quote currencies as one of the constructor parameters, it will automatically inflate a single string into your array ref currency code for you, just as part of the constructor. You get that for free. And in this case here, I mentioned that other coercion that named coercion that I created. I can create a temporary type, which I can then throw into the lines parameter attribute and the coercion. In Moose, all you would need to do is put the array ref plus conversion into the ISA and coerce one. The only reason I have to actually save it in a variable is that I have to have that variable to pass the coercion back again in the next parameter. But it still lets you, it stops you from creating a hell of a lot of other types when you don't necessarily need to, when you just want a simple restriction or coercion on a particular input. And the other real, sure.
In your lines, could you just say is a array ref, and then coerce array ref plus coercion? Like, so you don't.
You
have to
might be
define
able
that
to.
type.
You might be able to. I haven't tried it. I made an assumption. The coercion may work because it is just returning a code ref. So it may work where you just put the array ref here and array ref plus plus coercion, arrow coercion.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of an array ref X.
Yeah.
And then the coercion is array ref Y coercion.
Mm-hmm. That could very well work. You'd still have to do the plus coercion and then another arrow coercion to get the code ref. But yeah. Now type params is basically a simple way to do parameter validation in a method or sub that uses tiny types. In this case, you can create a class type of the invocant. So within this class, so you don't have to shift self off the argument stack, you can create basically a parameter validator. So type params has a compile directive. It doesn't work like params validate if you've ever used anything like it. It's a two-step process. You basically do a compile, and the arguments to compile are basically types that you are expecting. This is building your ordered, in this case, positional parameter list. And that returns a code ref. Now, if you're using Perl greater than 512 or 514 that at its state, if you have a modern version of Perl, you can do a state declaration, which is simply that this variable is instantiated only once. So successive calls, it remembers the value between calls. Alternately, what you can do is declare the compile, higher in scope and just consume it later. I love that you can use state if you're using a modern Perl. So in this case, we're compiling a parameter checker that is, the invocant in this case is just, $self, and expects a second positional parameter that is a string. You call that code ref. You can just call it right against that underscore, and it'll return a list of the parameters validated and coerced. If any of your types have coercions set on them, it will take it, coerce it, validate it, return it. If it failed the check, it will return nothing. It will be an undef. Or actually, I guess in this case, stir. We didn't make it optional. So actually, if it fails the validation, this subroutine will croak, or rather die. You can tell it to croak or die because it is invalid input. You can also do named parameters. You use this using the dict. The dict is basically a special case of a hash ref, and it makes it slurpy. So it basically says, the slurpy means take everything from here on in and shove it into this dictionary structure. So the keys are, of course, the names of your name parameters and the values of the types that you expect. Now, if you're expecting a structure that may or may not have certain keys and values, you can use optional. Basically, that says, I expect an integer, or I don't expect this to have been specified at all. So when you pass var foo into this and limit 1, that's okay. It passes. Foo, we just presume, is a reference of some kind. If you pass just var foo, that's okay, because limit is optional. And if you pass limit 1, it dies, because var is not optional, it's missing, so it will die when you do this parameter check. Now, this is a peculiar case that I noted, and it may have already been fixed. I had a problem originally with optional. When I was passing in the value, but it was an invalid value, and instead of dying, it just returned undef. So that was set to undef. I'm not sure why. I believe I tested this today, and it now blows up. So I don't know if it was something that was fixed between when I first wrote my code that used it, or I did something screwy. So this allows you to pass complex and deep data structures in, that are validated for its structure into a subroutine, and just really handy. It does not, however, handle defaults. You can't set default values unless basically you get the argument back. And in this case, when you do check on a Slurpy dict, you get a, that sounds horrible. I don't like saying that aloud. So it'll return this as a hash reference. And if it's optional and limit wasn't specified, this will just have the var key, not the limit key. So basically, after you've done the check, you then do defaults, or you would merge in defaults against your input initially. So you can always do some stuff there. I'm actually working on right now kind of an augmented version of type params. It allows you to do this stuff, but the point of it is to allow you a bit more control on error messages, specification of defaults. I'm kind of flailing a little bit on it because I keep trying to keep it similar in style to type params, but it's something I'm working on. It may never see the light of day because I start a billion projects and finish none. Except at work. Current employers and all future employers. You can even mix the parameters. So if you want to start with a positional parameter and end with a bunch of named parameters, you can do that. When you generate your code ref, you can just specify your required positional parameters first, and then Slurpy dictionary to get that in. So in this case, you could pass hello world color blue. So that gives you a bit of flexibility in how your parameter signature looks.
That's not named parameters where you can give them positionally. You have to give the positional parameters and then
the named parameters. Yeah, doesn't work either. It doesn't work both ways. The Slurpy is basically what says everything from here on out put into this dictionary structure. So yeah, you cannot put optionals. You can also do the optional in positional params. You can have optional around string, for example, but you must have the optional param at the end. You can't start with an optional param and then go to a required param. I know it can seem a bit esoteric, but what I've found is when you are working in an environment, when you're using something like Moose or Moo, it is really fantastic to be able to declare attributes of your class and use these types and have that parameter checking and coercion, which saves a lot of boilerplate code for this stuff, and to be able to use that with type params for the passing of arguments to more complex subroutines. It really allows you to take all of these things and group them into one place, and you can reuse them and mix them by creating different type param compiled checks. You can add on the fly. I didn't even have it here, but you can add two types together. They are overloaded. Type tiny is overloaded, so if you add types together, it means it passes this check or this check. So you can build very complex requirements and complex method signatures if you want. Don't go too crazy. Never more than 3 positional params. Personal opinion.
Good luck with that.
Does the check tell you which of the types match different alterations?
I have a question about this check thing.
Not really, no. I don't think so. It's a pass-fail. So so long as the value is valid, it doesn't tell you per se. You have to examine it yourself.
If you're taking multiple types, it's
yeah,
like undef of whatever. Well, okay, if it's undef, that means we didn't get one.
Mm.
But but you want to be able to pass it.
You can
that means
rely
you want
on-
to be able to check easily.
You could also,
Which it is.
but I mean, if undef is not one of your options, you can then be assured it is this or that and have, you know, a structure later. But it's, I haven't used much of the combining because it makes me wary that I'm going to forget what I did. And
So you'd have to do a check A or B and then do a check A
Mhm.
separately to figure out which it is. And assume it's in the check B in another place. Or
You could potentially. Sorry, you were saying, Alex?
Yeah. Forgive me if this is a silly question.
Not at all.
State check equals compile, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So state is like a static variable in C, so once it doesn't reinstantiate itself on a call,
Yes.
which suggests that
Oop, someone grab the door.
this code runs once, and then it stores the code ref, and then it doesn't run it the next time in.
Correct.
Okay.
This is just taking advantage of newer Perl goodness. In the absence of state, what you could do is, like I said earlier, you could throw it into a variable in the package and use it again there. The point is that it just has to compile once. And,
I just wanted to make sure I understood what was going on.
But I mean, that's really, the compile is basically so you're not regenerating this code ref every time. It's just a feature.
It's a
And type params. Yeah, and typorams is actually when the creator of it, Toby Inkster, actually ran some benchmarks. And yes, lies, damn lies, benchmarks. But it actually compares very favorably to other things like params validate. It's actually pretty spiffy, despite the fact being, you know, a bit object heavy. You can also, with type tiny in some of the manuals, there's a whole bunch of stuff that would allow you to do something like method signatures as opposed to doing this compile check. So there's a few projects that are out there that let you consume it that way and create proper method signature. Well, proper. Depends on your perspective, but I mean, a lot of people would really like to see proper method signatures in Perl, which are sort of coming, maybe. Yeah. Well, Perl 6 is definitely going to be here, but they're actually playing with it. Yeah.
In 520.
Yeah, they're playing with it in 520. Any other questions? No. And just a side note, this presentation, I hate presentation software. It all sucks. So I mentioned this earlier. This is using a Perl module called app-revealo. Reveal.js is the nice little pretty system that this is written in. But you have to basically write the HTML yourself, and it's a pain in the neck, and I always have trip over getting the code highlighting right and everything. This entire presentation is a single markdown file.
Nice.
And so this presentation, don't look at the proprietary stuff. And oh, look, email from my mom. Where are we? Let's just, where is it? I have it here. No. Where did I lose it? Where's my presentation? There it is. Okay. So it's written in there, and it basically allows you to run a little Plaque server and slurps up your slides into Reveal.js, and as you can see, it's running on localhost here.
Yep.
Now, obviously, if you save this, all of the stuff is now in the HTML file, all HTML file for you. But yeah, it made this writing things really awesome. So, just a little, hey, go for it. All right, thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Mike.
Real presentation software.
I sure hope so.
Getting set up.
Yay, I have Keynote.
I have one. Well, Mike's getting set up. Question about this.
Printed it.
No, that's just because I've given like too many presentations in too few days, and I can't remember which one this is. But it was that or be fired. So. What embarrassing stuff do I have on here?
I see sex.
Yeah, that's all my wife's stuff.
Lucky dog.
Where is... Where's the thing I copied onto there? Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing technical difficulties.
All service will be resumed.
There is no such thing.
Do not adjust your set.
2014. Okay. Try that again. Six.
Just for the record, I did not show. I mean, there's many more basic types. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with Type Tiny. This was just kind of a gentle introduction. I'd suggest exploring. Toby Inkster is awesome, and I have a huge code crush on him.
Does it compare? How does it compare in speed with Mrs. types?
Very comparable, if not better. But again, the beauty of it is that it's compatible across Moose, Mouse, Moo, or just use them yourself with type params. But no, it's surprisingly quick. And from what I understand, when he wrote it, he really wasn't eyeing, huge optimization on speed, but it just kind of worked out that way.
One of the great things I remember using Lisp years back was that it had ways of declaring a type, but it never really said what it did with it. So if you were running in a kind of safe mode, it would do all the type checking. And then if you switched it into dangerous mode, it would basically actually infer and assume that the types are actually right. And optimize your integer arithmetic. So it was really not, but it was the same code. That was the real beauty of it. So what would be great would be was the source filter kind of layer over it, where you can kind of switch it on and off your safety.
Yay!
Okay.
Presentation, they look different.
Sorry?
You don't have your fonts.
You don't.
There's always wingdings.
Okay, so sorry that there are gaps while I'm talking here because I have to remind myself what I intended to say. So basically this is just going to be a fun talk which kind of gives you some ideas about why some of the changes we hope to make in our organizations or in the way we do code don't really work out, particularly when you try and involve other people, like when you decide to impose change on them or expect them to be enthusiastic about the stuff that you're enthusiastic about. So because everybody remembers stuff in threes pretty easily, I've carved this talk up into 3 parts. There's the introduction, which we're currently excitedly listening to. There's a little bit about change and learning, that's the real meat of it, and then there's a swift conclusion. So there you are. Another happy little triplet is this is a road test of an idea. We had a talk at work about becoming agile and all this, that, and the other, and everyone felt very excited about it and then wondered why it didn't work. And I think we are way too success-oriented. Like there's things like your review at work, it all depends on how well you did and how little you screwed up, regardless of the fact that sometimes the screw-ups actually teach you a lot and are frequently more useful than a very ginger piece of learning where you just sort of, I take what I did last year and I paint it blue instead of green. There are lots of other papers on this kind of thing about, don't get conned into believing success is all you need. So I thought this was just a good excuse to wave a few things in front of you and see what you think. So,
This is not an auspicious beginning.
it is. I mean,
Actually, it was more of a termination, but it's.
It was an important learning opportunity.
and the lesson here was, first, hydrogen is perfectly safe to put in your airships because when it burns, it goes up. It doesn't actually fry anyone. More people got killed by diesel from the engines and falling than got killed by being incinerated by hydrogen. But the big ball of flame is much more spectacular. So lots of us might have heard at work this idea that failure is not an option. We have this new project that we have to roll out in 2 weeks, and you're all going to do super duper overtime. It's going to use untested technologies, and because you claim to be smart, you're not allowed to fail. Otherwise, your manager will look bad and he'll fire you all.
You know where the original quote failure was not an option?
Where?
From Apollo 13.
Well, oddly enough, that quote was never actually really used by the Apollo 13 team. When they were considering all the options, they didn't consider failure because the idea was to get them back, and nobody actually said failure is not an option. But
I thought it was Churchill.
But the really cool thing is it just shows how stupid managers are. And any manager who wants to employ me, I'm not talking about you, but they will grab these quotes like failure is not an option and quality is free without having the faintest idea of what lies behind them or what the context of the original quote was. Failure is not an option was just a summary that made it really nice for a film, and quality is free was, I think it was Drucker, wasn't it, who said quality is free as long as you're willing to pay heavily for it.
Quality is free, but it is not a gift.
Yeah.
That's the quote I remember.
Probably from Denny.
Yeah, it's one of those guys. But the important thing is actually failures are really important for exploring, and the way in which an organization deals with failure can either encourage people to take little risks and actually discover something useful, or it'll encourage them to do very rote, very sort of procedural work, and probably not advance as far as they could. And so failure shouldn't be discouraged too much.
Post-it note being a perfect example.
Yep, 3M having a glue that didn't work. Yeah. So why are we having this talk? Because it's going to be a quiet meeting. Everyone's in Yapsy. There's no code in it because Dave has already blown your minds with Type Tiny. And also another group of 3 is like I have 3 books that I really like and will never stop pushing, which are Peopleware, Drive, and Predictably Irrational. I've got some references to them at the end. I even have the books here if you want to have a peek at them afterwards.
Where I know, that's Tom
DeMarco and Tim Lister. Yeah.
3rd edition is out.
What about the other 2?
Drive is by Daniel Pink, and it's about what actually motivates people who are doing knowledge work, creative work, to work harder. And it does a whole load of, it mentions a load of experiments about how actually when you incentivize people with money, it can actually make performance work. And that kind of goes along with the sort of people-wary thing about if you beat people with a stick to make them work harder, it very rarely works, unless they're doing piecework or something like that, where you're not actually developing a skill, you're just either going faster or you're
Digging a ditch.
yeah.
Yeah, you can beat slaves, but you can't beat philosophers. Not if you want to be out.
Well, do philosophers produce output?
You have to be careful saying that.
Sorry, Suzanne. And then Predictably Irrational is a very fun book by Dan Ariely. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. But it goes through a whole load of cases where smart people behave in really stupid ways. And the annoying catch is that even when we're aware that we make these mistakes, we can't avoid doing them. Like, we can be very mindful, we can avoid some of them, but just relying on people to be perfectly logical all the time, it is a really bad way of predicting human behavior. And particularly when you get into stuff like change, where, well, I'm going to say that later. But okay, so that's the introduction over, and now we're going to start talking about change and learning, which hopefully is slightly less menacing and catastrophic. Any worthwhile change has to have some risk in it. That's the assertion I'm making. There are all sorts of little changes that you can do, little incremental things, which may over time add up to something worthwhile. But if you're going to change the way your company does business, or pick a new tool to work with, or pick a new programming paradigm, there's a lot of risk there, because you can't guarantee you're going to make that jump, that you're sort of mentally prepared for it, your organization's prepared, and so on. And so you need to understand and prepare for success and failure. And the reason I put them in quotes here is because sometimes success, where you sort of hop onto a new thing and it all works out peachily, it might just mean it's not a really big difference. You're not actually going to get a huge change from it. You might get your 5% incremental improvement in performance, but you might not have risked too much if you get an easy success. And similarly, failures in quotes, because you may fail to adopt process X or language Y, but if you actually learn something worthwhile about your team or the problem you're trying to solve or yourself, then that may inform a future decision, and you'll get a return on that investment. And again, going back to sort of crazy managers, if they say you've wasted 4 weeks on putting this prototype together that didn't work, maybe they just haven't grasped, that there is a risk-reward balance. And
Richard Branson had some interesting things to say on this, and one of his things is looking at what the worst possible downside is. If you can cope with that, go ahead and do it.
Yes, you can survive it, then
yes.
Jump in.
Spaceships now.
Yes.
There was actually a lovely idea in Daniel Kahneman's book called Pre-Mortem. You actually get people to write basically the worst possible thing that could have happened, and to write a story about how it actually happened before you make a difficult decision, to kind of explore the possible worst outcome. And it did actually really work as a way of thinking through and adjusting their ideas about how to actually do it. I think it's a fantastic idea. Where sort of those really important decisions, to just get people to imagine catastrophic failure from it before it actually happens.
Once you're comfortable with catastrophic failure, then
Then you can embrace it.
yes.
Or you can see how to hit it off.
Yeah.
Although you have to, going way off track here, but you have to watch out. It's like when you're driving, when I started driving, the mistake I made was to look at the other cars, so you kind of aimed at them rather than looking at the gaps where you actually really want to be. So if once you've fallen in love with catastrophic failure,
yeah, there is a problem with
the value in looking at the possible catastrophic failures is that often you can find a simple way to test whether it will happen. So rather than spending 4 months and then failing, you can spend a week and say, yes, it would fail. but here's why, and a different approach we can use.
Yeah.
So you can see the same learning a lot faster.
Particularly at the professional level, an awful lot of pilot training is examining potential disasters and working out what to do.
Yeah. One of the interesting applications of sort of risk is agile techniques, where quite often you have multiple concentric, well not concentric loops, but nested loops, where you do something, you look at its outcome, and then you decide if you want to carry on doing it or you want to change it. And it can be from your kind of the red-green refactor loop as you're coding, where you've got a failing test, you write some code that works, then you refactor it and hopefully it still works, and if you've broken it, you keep going through, to your sprints with their retrospectives, where I'm limiting the risk because I'm only going to do 2 weeks crappy work. There may be some learning there, and at the worst I've only lost 2 weeks before changing course. And to be able to actually embrace those, you have to say, oh yeah, there is a chance that at the end of this sprint we will have screwed up and we'll learn something from it, and I have nothing to fear from my project manager or manager, because that's the deal here. We're trying stuff out, we're doing the best we can, and we've hopefully announced at the beginning that this is what we're intending to do. Everyone agreed that that's where we were going for the next couple of weeks, or how long the sprint is. So that kind of thing requires a mature approach to failing and the possibility of failure, and not just then pointing fingers at, So how can we actually sort of prepare people for change and learning? Because if you're going to change your processes, you have to learn to do something differently. Like, you're not just going to do the same thing again. And out of peopleware, there's this kind of spectrum of people's responses to change, going from the people who seem nicest at the top, who are the sort of blindly loyal, they say, yes, boss, I'll be right on that, let's go, to the guys at the bottom who want to keep things the way they are and will undermine you for taking risks, or undermine you for slowing things down, because whenever you have change, there are slowdowns and people take time to learn. And then there's this group in the middle, believers but questioners, and they're the people who you have to prepare, because the blindly loyal and the militantly opposed, you might as well just forget them. They are going to stick to their opinions whether you like it or not. You might as well go for the swing vote in the middle. And they range from sort of people who say, yeah, I can hear this sounds sensible, but I want to see it, all the way up to the people who are opposed because, let's say, we pick someone like John, who's got 1 million years of Perl experience, and we say, you're now going to use, Haskell. And at that point, someone says, look, I have this mastery in Perl, and I know how to wield this tool. And there's going to be a risk while I'm learning this new thing that my perceived value is going to go down, because I'll be a beginner again. And those kind of things are not really rational. It's more about my personal image of myself, how the balance of power in an organization is going to mess up. It's going to be changed and fluid for a while. And so when we try and prepare these people, we have to say, this change is going to happen, and there's going to be, it's going to be uncomfortable. So one really good way of doing this is to sort of talk about models of change. Normally, people's idea of a change in an organization, particularly when it's presented in a retrospective, is we have the old status quo, the way we were working.
We've always done it.
Yeah. Someone comes along with a really bright idea, and hey presto, here we are. We're in a new status quo. we're doing 50% more work per week. And that's actually a pretty sort of naive view of how change happens.
Some definition of better.
Yeah, a better way of doing things to try and improve productivity, improve yield, I don't know. And that's almost always the way people describe stuff afterwards. Like, you know, we were doing it the shitty way, Fred had a really great idea, and now everything's a lot better. But a more realistic way of preparing people for change is to sort of say, you know, we're going to go from the way we're working now to hopefully a better future. Normally, we need some external interference to decide to change. Like if you're going along making widgets and the world is great and you're making enough money to pay your employees, there's really no reason to change what you're doing. But if a competitor enters the field, or if there's some new technology, or you get a new marketing director who has really wacky ideas, then they'll come in and disrupt things. And for a period, there will be chaos. Because people sort of say, where are we going to go from here? How does this affect us? It's some interrupt that suddenly caused us to stop and step back. At some point, somebody will have an idea of how to deal with this chaos. Like, how is the way we can get out of this? Is there a way? And then, once some notional progress has been sort of formulated, it has to be practiced and integrated. And in both those chaos and practice and integration periods, people's productivity is low. People are feeling a little bit threatened, like things are different and uncertain. And if your manager comes along to you and says, you know, why aren't things going better? When are you going to deliver and whatever? People are pretty naturally going to think, we're worse off now than we were before. There's a deadline looming. Let's retreat and go back to the old way we did things. This is why you get these half-cooked, we're going to use 4GLs if you're around in the 80s, like 4GLs, we're going to transform everything. And it's a very kind of slow, gentle move up as the practice and integration takes and people get used to the new way of doing things, the new results. Only after you've actually internalized all that, you get to a new status quo, which hopefully is better than the old one. But it's a very risky way, and people will feel worried going along that road. And to make people more prepared to change, you have to prepare them for this. You know, there's going to be a few bumps in the road, and I expect some wrong turns, and there'll be a period of reduced productivity. And I think it was a woman called Satir came up with this model of change and said basically most changes you can model like this, and it helps people have a roadmap of, you know, where are we on the road to the promised land? Like, you know, are we 20 days into the 40 days in the wilderness, or are we hopefully on that last little bit back up?
I think you're familiar with the Machiavelli quote about the creation of a new order of things.
Yeah, he had a few good ideas about, you know,
Who was for it and who would be against it.
pretty much everyone's against it.
Well, I think the original quote was that there's nothing more difficult or dangerous than the creation of a new order of things. So you have the determined opposition of all who would benefit under the old system, and only lukewarm support from those who would benefit under the new.
Yep, so the deck is stacked. A second good idea for dropping on people, if they're not familiar with it, is the learning zone model, which I think, was it a guy called Seninger proposed? Basically, everyone has a comfort zone in some particular dimension, you know, like playing an instrument, driving, whatever. You know where your limits are, and you can happily gamble around in there without actually stretching yourself, without actually getting any better. Like, you just sort of maintain your level of skill. You might get better by accident, but you're not being stretched. Just outside your comfort zone, where you're still close enough to familiar territory, there are opportunities to learn. This might come on a wet road when you're going a little bit faster than normal, but it's not like a total catastrophe. You'll learn something about how your tires are, how your car is, and how to respond. But if you push people too hard, or you change too many things around them, you go too far outside their comfort zone, there's a thing called the panic zone, where basically people are so busy just trying to keep their feet on the ground and their nose pointing in the right direction that they're not actually learning stuff, they're just surviving, they're trying not to screw up. So particularly if you're trying to lead a team or you're being led, you want to find out where your boundaries of your learning zone are, like sort of feedback stuff to people like, I can't deal with this because there's just too much going on. A smart leader will realize that there is no learning progress to be spoken of in the panic zone or the comfort zone. In one, you're not really stretching yourself, and in the other, you don't have the mental energy to sort of actually learn and organize new experiences.
One thing that may be happening in the panic zone is that some of your lukewarm supporters are now being terrified into being determined opponents.
Yep.
It also creates interference.
I have been in this panic zone. It's not fun.
Probably when some idiot was running around trying to oppose an ideology.
You leave my wife out of this.
And the resolution is kind of low, but the that last point was meant to be the best learning is at the outer edge of your learning, of the learning zone. Like if you can just get close to panic for brief periods, that little extra piece of stress can be invigorating. But when I say close to and for brief periods, I mean both of those, because if you prolong stress, people just shut down. And no amount of kind of encouragement will help. And my sort of final thing in this load of triplets is from Daniel Pink's book. And these are the things that he claims motivate knowledge workers. The first thing he says is like autonomy. If you have a sense of some kind of control over your own destiny, that's a good thing. And again, I kind of go back to Agile and Scrum, where in theory, you have a bucket of tasks for your group, and actually the group members get to choose who picks what off. Like they're not told what particular tasks they have to do in what particular order. They get to do that. Mastery is very important. Like people enjoy feeling good at something, feeling competent, feeling able to do it. And if people can feel like they're getting closer to mastery or they're on the road to it, that's a big incentive to actually expend effort and to enjoy doing it. The final thing in his big broad spectrums are purpose. Like there's kind of a difference between making Morgan Stanley an extra $100,000 and helping starving people survive. And many people have a kind of ethical view of whether the work they're doing is really useful or just kind of mindless. And if the purpose of the work they're doing aligns with their particular moral compass, then that tends to drive them along too. Cheap. And this is where I was kind of running out of time, so I couldn't get 3 bullet points on this slide. Looking at predictably irrational, basically the lessons from that book are we aren't as rational as we think, even if we're really smart and really logical and well trained. But we can try and avoid some of the pitfalls by knowing what they are. And one of the examples from the book is, a restaurant will sometimes have a really high-priced entree that nobody actually buys, but what it does is it desensitizes them to the second most expensive one, which you may actually invent so that it has cheap ingredients, but you can charge a higher price for it, so you get a good margin. And because people see the higher thing, they think I'm getting good value for this second thing, and they don't actually analyze any further. Similarly with TV sets at the Bay or whatever, you'll have the mega expensive one, and then the really expensive one doesn't seem quite that bad, and you can probably justify to yourself.
But honey, we're saving so much by buying the cheaper one.
Yeah. And so one way that this kind of understanding our lack of rationality can help is to take some pressure out of choices, like saying, yeah, I do occasionally screw up, and it is a human thing to not do it, particularly if you're having change imposed on you when you're there are too many things going on for you to take that extra day off and think about it and let your subconscious digest it. So now, I'll get
That's possible
that is possible.
with Photoshop.
No, that's right.
Fuck that.
The right-hand one, if you imagine a small balloon with a big skirt that sort of hangs down around it, and the basket is actually in the middle of that black circle.
Oh, those sneaky bastards.
So
That's pretty funny. That's ingenious. I've never
I
seen
don't-
that. I'm impressed.
I don't do heights well. That doesn't help.
I'd hate to be doing aerobatics and see that come up.
yep. Which way up am I? Okay, so basically, to make change work, you need to have some sense of safety. And there are ways to prepare yourself or your team or whatever by explaining that change is going to be risky, that we're not all going to make the right decisions every time, and that this change might help you on your way to mastering something new, or there's something in it for you. Like there has to be a carrot at the end sometimes to make it a little more palatable. And loads of people have talked about the value of taking on risk. I just grabbed a couple of quotes. Smooth seas don't make for skillful sailors. You have to occasionally get into something a little bit. Yeah, but not too far over your head. And if you want to succeed greatly, you've got to be willing to take the risk of failing. But hopefully some of the stuff in those books is kind of useful, and you're interested in the sort of psychology of change and imposing change. And so, for the benefit of anyone still watching, both of you, these are the books, Peopleware, Drive, and Predictably Irrational, which I actually have, if you want to thumb through them and see what they're like over a beer. And then the various quote pictures and stuff, because I wouldn't use those without at least
Attribution.
an attribution, although I think the camera and balloons attribution is off the bottom, because the thing is, but. And that is that. Any questions? Or
Perhaps if I can tell a war story. Well, first of all, the thing is, you have to consider the psychology of the people you're dealing with. There's some groups which I suspect are self-selecting that are really terrified of change, and so they pick up jobs, particularly in the Ontario Civil Service. A colleague was teaching a course in which she had a list, and she had a list of cities to Brantford and Toronto, Montreal, and I think Boston. And one of the students came up with Boston is the city. Instantly, it's the city. And she mentioned being forced to confront this idea of a city that was not in Ontario. But within that same environment, I introduced a system to deal with trivial accounting, cost accounting for accounting house and accounting. And one of the other ministries said the finance director had been so proud of it, he'd shown it off to his peers, and one of the other finance directors, one of the other ministries wanted it. Went to introduce it. Now there was the finance director, there was a manager, and there was the clerk who actually did the work. The clerk desperately wanted to get away from their current way of doing it, which was involved in an accounting machine, which was so noisy in its own room. And the manager in the middle, I think, fancied himself as a computer expert of some sort, because I found the machine that they had, and there was some code on it, curiously like mine, copy, but he hadn't been able to get it implemented. And so the director wanted it, the clerk wanted it, but the manager didn't. He did everything in his power to sabotage the introduction. Every time I got to train the clerk, he would yank her off to something else. The time of the conversion approached, and all of a sudden there was a crisis. The special checks, which had to be ordered in advance for the accounting machine, had mysteriously run out. The checks for my system were completely standard and could be had from going right by running into Grand Tour where you get the check. The thing about that was, guess who was responsible for ordering special codes checks?
Right at the top.
No, the clerk.
Yeah.
You have to be. She wanted the new system to come in, and she engineered it.
Yeah.
To the somewhat chagrin of the manager in between.
Well, one of the problems with sort of quite hierarchical organizations is also you can induce learned helplessness.
Yeah.
Which is basically when people are so afraid of failure that they're actually unable to take risks. And actually you can induce that in people quite easily. The education system is really good at doing it by just making people freak out so much about assessment, constant assessment, that they won't actually try to learn, basically, because it's easier to just try and, it's less stressful and less dangerous to actually just do what you're told.
So no personal experience with that at all, Professor?
It's actually it's a classic psychological thing. So it's a classic known psychological effect.
I believe it.
This idea of learning, and you can even see it in animals. You can actually induce it in animals. A lot of the early tests were actually done by putting animals in painful situations, and it got to a point where they were more or less just hide in the corner. They wouldn't even eat. They wouldn't even try anything. They wouldn't do anything because they just learned to become helpless because anything else was bad. But you can actually see the same thing happen in organizations too. If you make every single risk likely to, induce, if there is a failure, the reward is disproportionately, the penalty is disproportionately painful. People just won't take risks anymore. So the organization needs to create a nice environment as well and make sure that the failures are not punished. They're actually recognized and they're framed as constructive opportunities to do this better next time. Otherwise, the organization is also just going to be totally dysfunctional about it.
I can't say I've been a place where something, a project failed utterly. I mean, you can argue that there were failures and it perhaps didn't do what everyone wants, but we're not like, yeah.
All the big IT ones, the e-health record system.
That's what I mean, though.
They're everywhere.
But none of these projects were as big a risk either. I don't know how the organizations I've worked for would handle a failure, a genuine failure. Even if it was just 4 weeks of work of 5 people is rendered useless. I don't know how most organizations I've ever worked for would handle that. That would be catastrophic in their view.
What actually happened with the organizations I saw Agile? Agile was embraced as a principle, but they didn't actually understand that really it was about changing your attitude to risk. So what tended to happen would be that they would implement all the processes of Agile, which involved monitoring tickets and having the monthly sprints. But in practice, they were just using it as a micromanagement technique. And the whole system was completely identical to what it was before. And as far as I can tell, that's exactly what happened with the Obamacare rollout. That they actually thought they were doing Agile, but in practice, it was a roadmap leading up to exactly the same deadlines. They didn't go for this idea of implementing, the core small features first, making them solid, moving on to the next stage. Instead, it was just like the first little bit towards this big picture that they always had. They would never work in that kind of a way. And I think that's one of the problems that you tend to get with Agile, is that if you don't actually frame a thing differently, if you don't make that mental shift, then you're basically just creating a more stressful way for people to fail, because they're actually going to have their failures thrown at them more frequently and earlier than they would do in a waterfall.
Cargo cult implementation.
Yeah.
We're dancing on the dances and we're wearing the earphones, but
the free skirt.
but we're not actually.
I'm aware.
My boss used to do that here as well. He just didn't get Agile. So for him, it was just like, it was an opportunity for him to see, all the tasks that people had failed to achieve in the last sprint, so he could basically play in the monthly meetings.
I think there's also a failure to understand the difference between civil engineering and interior decoration. That there is, in any project, there's some core fundamentals. If you're going to build a bridge, you've got to know that you've got a rock here and a rock there, and put it between them. And there are some things there that have to be sorted out, firmly in advance. And there's other stuff, sort of the colour of the curtains, that you can experiment with until the cows come home without any real consequences. But it's knowing which falls into which category. It's one thing. And of course, in the case of complex systems, very often the problem is knowing which falls into what. I'm sure you've been through many meetings where there have been endless hours devoted to stuff that turned out to be trivial. The
structure of the meetings were devoted to things that turned out to be trivial, which is actually
the fewer people, the more important.
Yeah.
Provided you've made sure that anybody who's got the important stuff has the opportunity to put it in, because there is sometimes that clerk in the corner who understands something vital about the system. It has to be a way to get the information out.
But I think Mike's right. It's failure. It's about how you frame it. Can you frame it as a positive thing, and can you get senior people to accept that it's a positive thing?
They have to get past what they view as the failure, which is no money or no value for money.
Exactly.
They don't. It is value, but they just see time lost as money lost.
I mean, it's the same in research alarming, because we're doing science. You design an experiment. The whole point in way science is working, it's supposed to work by falsification. So you come up with a hypothesis, but you can't actually prove your hypothesis. All you can really do is disprove it. So, but in practice, all scientists want to prove that hypothesis. And they talk about if the experiment doesn't work, they get very stressed about how am I going to get significant data to say that my hypothesis is still sound. They won't get away from that kind of mindset. Now, a good researcher will say, it doesn't really matter what happens. You know, you're going to get some data out. It's either going to be positive or negative. If it's negative, that's an important learning opportunity because it's telling you that your hypothesis is wrong.
Well, you use that to build your next hypothesis.
Exactly. But even scientists will think that way.
Going to be in advance. You're not doing it.
It's not research.
Sufficiently challenging hypothesis.
But you listen to the way they talk, and it's exactly the same. It's like, damn, I didn't get a significant result.
Well, the correct way to frame things is that success is the failure to fail.
Yes. Yes.
The most productive words in science are
Fuck.
that's fucking. Probably recognizing that is the difference between the journeyman scientist and the real discoverer.
And I actually used to write I sort of cooked up a method where you'd actually write the paper before you actually have the data, which actually does help. Because you actually don't know what the conclusion is when you're writing a paper. That makes it actually easier.
Is that test-driven development as applied to the scientific method?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. I think there's actually a lot of lessons that science can actually learn from Agile. It just hasn't really worked out that that's what it needs to do.
How easy it is to do badly.
Yeah, and also a lot of science is like that. You know, you write a grant proposal. You are basically saying, give me 3 years of money to do this. And you say exactly what you're intending to do. And we know
It's all
that actually in software, you can never do that. It's bull. So what people do is they take the money. What they usually do is they try to come on a pattern where you do some work for nothing. You get some results. You then write a grant proposal to say, I'm going to do 2 years of work to come up with these results, which I already know. You get awarded the funding, you take that funding to do the next piece of research, to come up with the next idea. So you're basically, out of step between the results and the funding.
It's not that it's paying it forward.
It is
Funny, I thought it was fraud.
Yeah, fraud is another description.
That's very judgmental.
So the danger of writing your report before you do the work, it tends to bias how you observe the work and
Yeah.
carry it out.
I think the difference
Match what you wrote.
between experimenting and fraud there is if you insist on making the results come up to match the report pre-written.
Well, that never happens.
No, there's no fraudulent academics ever.
Oh, look at those outliers. We'll just pretend they're not there.
Confirmation bias kicking in.
You mean like drug trials that give the wrong results and never get published?
And confirmation bias is another issue. It's what people are doing with change as part of this confirmation bias. I'm biased. It's another part of the thing. I'm expecting to see stuff that fits in my current mindset.
There are people that actually believe that they are unbiased. I've tried to explain how impossible
List of
that is.
cognitive biases. I think there's 150 at the moment.
That's got to encompass a few of them.
The ozone hole was sort of covered up for a while when that was the results were outside the expected rather than discarded as
Yeah.
Actually, there's something I've just been watching. There's a series, National Geographic reality TV series, made of a place just north of here called Guild of Automobile Restorers. If anybody's heard of it. It's a custom and historic car restoration outfit. There was a season of nine programs, and I started watching it because I was interested. I'd been there, I know the vehicles, and I'm interested in cars, but it actually turned out to be a very interesting series from a management point of view. There's a lot of the management interaction there, and clearly staff development. One of the things that they've done. I know Does the Bugatti Atlantic mean anything to you?
Sorry, what?
The Bugatti Atlantic mean anything?
Oh, I thought you said Lac Megantic. And they're like, that means something.
Okay. There were Bugatti built 3 or 4 cars called the Atlantic coupe on a particular chassis. Last time one sold it was $33 million. There was a prototype for this that was allegedly made in magnesium. And one of the unusual features, because magnesium is so difficult to work with, the car actually has certain parts of it riveted together. There's a riveted spine, which gives it quite a distinctive look. Well, these people had a Type 57 chassis lying around, and a client with a lot of money and interest in research. And so they recreated this aerolith, I'm sorry, is the name. Apparently the suppliers of, first of all, this magnesium sheet is $3,500 a sheet. Yes, there it is. The one in the middle of the bottom is the recreation. It's an absolutely gorgeous piece of work. It's constructed from a material which is brutally intractable. The gap between the point at which you can weld it and the point at which it spontaneously catches fire is quite small. Apparently, you can form it using a wheel in the fashion that the English wheel that you do with the aluminum. And the following morning, the bloody stuff will be flat again.
Interesting.
So it's extraordinarily difficult, but they eventually worked. One of the first guys who worked on it, who's clearly a very skilled metal worker, asked to be taken off the project because it was giving him nightmares. Mm-hmm. And then they got another guy who first joined them as a janitor, but his enthusiasm is French Art Deco cars. So a pile of books on Bugattis, that right. And I was thinking, watching these guys working away in these materials and producing these gorgeous things, who is really the knowledge worker? Somebody who can create that, or some weenie in a cubicle pushing numbers around with a spreadsheet.
I can honestly say I've produced nothing of value for the world. And it has resulted in absolutely no physical representation of any work I have ever done. That wasn't work.
But you're not even...
their work.
I mean, actually, I've had a thing about Drucker for some time about this, that and the knowledge that I can give you examples of the economic value of knowledge back in the 18th century. I mean, I think that it's been a knowledge economy since the first guy discovered that the stone from over there worked better than the stone from over there. Just didn't get to code it.
No, that's not it. I mean, there's having knowledge, and the knowledge economy is about when you can make a living. But the kind of knowledge that comes with that, and the shift from actually producing to actually having an idea. So, the fact that Apple don't actually make anything, they just construct designs, means they're a knowledge economy business, whereas they used to actually be a computer manufacturer. So they've sort of shifted from one to the other.
So there's a specialization.
The question is, do you actually, physically make something that ends up in a device somewhere? Most of us probably don't.
But do you contribute to? Do you contribute to the creation of something? If you organize it so that the guy with the metal has somebody on one side supplying him with the metal he needs, so that he doesn't have to run around and look for it.
I mean, if he built that and then didn't tell anybody how he built it, there would be no knowledge connection to it. If he actually developed new techniques for working with magnesium, wrote an article about it, that's terrific. And also fantastic industrial innovation.
I seriously wonder whether the original could in fact have been constructed material, whether what we've done since then is. It's, I would recommend it. It's a YouTube Restoration Garage will find it.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the broadcast now.
Yep.
Cheers. See you all to infinity and beyond.
Goes into oblivion.